I'm back after that little break. One of the things that's interesting here, though, is Steinberg's contention about how new art comes around. What most people imagine is if you want to create something new and intriguing, the way to get there is by additive means. We're going to bring something new to art, which it didn't have before, and which is going to make it richer, more complicated, more ample. And yet, when you look at the statements from the lead artists or leading artists who are first traumatized by innovative works, though they will eventually come around to appreciate these works of art, what they complain about is never that something has been put into art which doesn't belong there, but rather something has been taken away from art which does belong there and which consequently disqualifies this work from being considered legitimate and compelling. The work seems incomplete. And so Braque, one of the great innovators, along with Picasso, of that school of painting known as Cubism, he says it feels like we've been given tow and paraffin to eat instead of normal food. And, their usual diet has been denied them, and so now they're going to have to go hungry. But Steinberg's contention, as a matter of fact, is that it's through subtraction that we get, it's through deprivation that we get new and important works of art that really breaks open territory where we've never been before, and in so doing braces us, shocks us, traumatizes us, makes us feel deliberately deprived, and then we have to find a way to discover how this loss is actually a gain. And the word that Steinberg will use for this is sacrifice. Sacrifice is a way of giving something up, but with the understanding that at some higher level you're going to be able to recuperate for this loss. And I think that's really interesting, because this notion of sacrifice was also one that was dear to the anthropologist from whom Steinberg gets his idea about social roles and the way that we move between these different roles in ways that the individual simply cannot control. At some larger social level, we are being caused to flow from one identity to another, and there's really not much the individual can do to stop that. That's the nature of being triggered. It's the nature of what Mauss called practical ideas. Even before you get a chance to decide what you're going to do, you've already made the decision, and now it's your chance to try to understand why you acted the way that you did. And that's one of the jobs of criticism. But in any case, it's this reductive means of creation that Steinberg will associate with sacrifice. And he'll say the plight of the public comes from the incapacity to make sacrifice either of a kind or at a rate of somebody else. And so we feel left in exile, or we feel left at a loss. We feel left behind because somebody's marching off into the desert on some great errand which they and they alone understand, and we're unable to leave behind whatever necessities would allow us to survive that perilous trip through the wilderness. Somehow this other person's able to get along without things which we consider to be absolutely essential, And for that reason, they can go where the rest of us are not able. One day, seeing that they have been able to survive this ordeal, we may come to realize that, oh my goodness, the human mind, the human heart, had to not just survive, but to thrive under conditions which we never knew to be possible. But now we do know. And once we see that it's possible, it becomes desirable to try to do it ourselves. And we're going to try to explain to ourselves what exactly this person is doing to survive under these conditions. What new mode of life have... So the first person that Steinberg will argue to think in these sacrificial terms is the poet from the age of... He's the definitive French bohemian that I was talking about, Charles Baudelaire. And you don't have to know who Baudelaire was other than he wrote some amazing poems under the title The Flowers of Evil. He developed quite a reputation for himself in that manner. But he also attended the salons, which is to say the art exhibits of the day, R-E-S, although it's pronounced in French. He's considered one of the great painters of the day, as is another guy who's coming up the ranks called Courbet. And he gets mentioned as the origins of Bohemia, the origins of modern art, in Steinberg's article earlier on. Now, Baudelaire himself doesn't care for either of these two paintings. The painter that he actually likes most is Delacroix. You may recognize his work, The Milkmaid. Picks up a French flag and it becomes a symbol of freedom, while various other people from the lower classes pick up arms and they're going to head off to start a revolution. Now, this kind of art was appealing to Baudelaire because it showed a fair amount of technical skill, but that technical skill was employed in conveying what Baudelaire thought were powerful emotions. And skin looks like, porcelain. He's creating modern bourgeois people to look like they were Greek gods. He actually does this. He does of Napoleon. He sacrificed his feeling to gain some loftier vision of what art might be. He doesn't like the painting, but he does admire the courage that it takes to paint in such a cold, clinical style and to leave other concerns completely out of the equation. On the other end of the scale, though, we've got Courbet, who he was the first of what is known as the Barbizon school. Barbizon means what? These guys grew their beards out, in rebellious style. They wanted to look like peasants, and Courbet, the foremost among them, actually goes outside of the studio and begins to paint earthy, humble, downright dirty people in all kinds of unsophisticated postures. We wouldn't even call them poses of the sort that somebody like Ong would have been using. And he's using paint in such a way that the greens and the browns begin to combine with one another. It just looks muddy. It looks dirty to people. Again, Baudelaire thinks this is lacking all of the high, lofty idealism of somebody like Ong, but gaining at least a new view of how paint can be applied to canvas in order to produce a whole new school of art. So again, he doesn't like the gritty dirtiness of Courbet, though he admires his willingness to sacrifice lofty ideals. That takes courage. And he doesn't like Ong's coldness, but he admires his willingness to sacrifice, there's that word once again, the warmth and the emotional appeal that you'd find in other painters. So ever since Baudelaire's time, this notion of sacrifice as a part of modern creativity, and continues to be one as artist after artist after artist comes up with new ways to go without. He talks about this with Matisse when he describes the joy of life. All of the immediate rewards of looking at these nude bodies prancing around in a classical landscape. The bodies seem boneless and flabby. They seem to have been, like I said, poured out of a jar of Pepto-Bismol. There's a line as big as your thumb going all the way around the bodies, but it doesn't seem to create a hard and fast contour, but it only makes the body seem to melt into the background all the more. Those very figures which should act as magnets to the eye or as points of focus, they're practically indistinguishable from the background, so that it becomes very, very difficult. He says it almost takes a perverse form of concentration to keep your eye riveted on the figures. As a result, though, of losing the figure and ground distinction, the eye is now invited not to stand still or to focus on one object, but to move all over the painting in a ceaseless process of circulation, like either the blood circulating through the body or traffic, both vehicular and pedestrian, circulating through a city. And once you begin to see that the kind of rest and repose of the eye, which used to be considered, the goal of great art, this has been through the deliberate refusal to provide us with figures that jump out against the background. This has now given us a new way of looking at painting, in which every square inch of the canvas is potentially as important, as potentially interesting as every other square inch of the canvas. And now it's the power of the painting cause the eye to move, and it opens up a whole new kind of painting which will influence artist after artist right up into the 20th century, where movement and what we call the all-over effect becomes now desirable. But this is achieved through subtraction, through sacrifice, not through addition. He'll talk about many of the most important modern painters from around the turn of the 20th century, and how each one of them uses Matisse's breakthrough from 1906 to claim permission to do something wild and imaginative that had never been done before. A personal anecdote that Steinberg gives us, meant to illustrate, if this is the theory that Steinberg's putting out, then how's he going to prove it? That sounds great in theory, but what about in practice? And so he's going to use a personal anecdote. 1958, so it's a few years before the writing of this, he talks about going to see Jasper John's work. And I put up a few of those pieces for you to see on the blog as well. In particular, I put up that target with 4 faces. So he goes to see this new display. There's both paintings and sculptures in it. But he notices as he walks around, and nobody's ever seen this stuff before, people are immediately beginning to launch off into opinions. And the opinions tend to be very divided. People either think this is the greatest new thing that they've ever seen, or they think it's the worst stuff that they've ever seen, and they want to, again, prove that this is a hoax. Either it's just a ripoff, or it's a waste of time. One French critic is tempted to cry out fraud. He shows a certain amount of constraint, but everybody feels obligated to say something right up front. Steinberg doesn't make a public statement right up front, but he is willing to admit that he found himself to feel bored and, frankly, anxious to go home. As long as we're talking about anxiety, he just wants to get out of here. Why are we looking at this stuff? Because to him, the painting looks deliberately de-skilled. It looks like in an age where masterful brushwork is the be-all and end-all of painting, this is somebody who can't paint any sort of illusion. Again, we talked about what artists want to do traditionally is have figures stand forth against a background. This is what painters call making the painting pop, when you get that effect of depth. When you look at Johns's paintings, they're absolutely devoid of any sort of depth. And the reason is Johns has chosen only to paint those things which are, by their nature, two-dimensional. So he paints numbers, and he paints letters, he paints flags, and he paints targets and this type of thing, and he paints them using not trained and controlled brushstroke that comes from years and years of practice, or more importantly, an expressive gesture. But his brushstroke, or the stroke of his hand, is going to be controlled by stencils and by outlines and by protractors and rulers. So everything is curiously flat and curiously lifeless. If Johns does want to create something three-dimensional, he's not going to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object, but he's going to simply cast one out of bronze or cast one out of Sculpey or something like that. And he doesn't cast heroic figures. He doesn't cast anything that we could call monumental or of great importance. Beer cans, light bulbs, dentures, and they just sit there, these colorless gray objects on a pedestal in the museum, and that's art. And again, people are either horrified or they're falling all over themselves to say that this stuff is the next big thing. And what Steinberg again says is that they left him kind of feeling bored and empty. But if they were that boring, why wouldn't he just forget about them? And yet they gnaw at him. They haunt his memory. He can't get them out of his head. And finally he realizes, oh my God, this aggressive, unrelenting boredom, this is the plight of the public. I have it just like anybody else. And he tries then to come up with an explanation for why these things stay on his mind. What about them is striking? If they show no imagination, if they are painted in a way which is deliberately drab and almost deliberately childish, and not just ignore them, and it really does feel to him as if this is the end of the line. And after a while, he starts to think, well, maybe that's it. Art is over. If we've gotten rid of all illusion and all artists want to do now is trace flat objects and cast out of molds everyday three-dimensional objects, maybe this is the end of the line. But the sense of solitude that is so pervasive in these works of art starts him to think that maybe there's some type of he says, uncanny inversion of values. So he says, look, targets, faces, these are linguistically what we call shifters. Words like I and you, or here and there, now and then. These are the most basic pointing words which we use to open up a meaningful space in which we can exist, in which we can inhabit. Johns is going to notice is that the face, which is in a way that human representation, which more than any other says, I am here, or you are here, we're here together. It's like a Beatles song. But here-ness is what the face represents. And by being so seemingly violently or indifferently just chopped and stored away on a shelf, here-ness has now been put over there. Meanwhile, a target, for it to be worth anything at all, has to be over there. You don't want a target up here, it loses its meaning. So here-ness and there-ness have been removed, and we are now left with the sense of objects which have been taken completely out of circulation and which create, when we behold them, a sense of desolate waiting. It's a sense that this door is waiting to be open. This drawer is waiting to be open. These dentures are waiting to be inserted. This hanger is waiting to receive a coat. We're seeing all of these as if all of the human meanings or all of the human relations which make these objects meaningful have suddenly been interrupted or terminated. He says it's like looking at a dead city, yet a dead city, which is terribly familiar. Well, think about this. What famous city do you know that was in an instant suddenly wiped out by a tremendous catastrophe, and the primary objects that we have remaining of it are just casts, usually of plaster, of dead people and dead animals, which have been created as plaster of Paris was poured into the natural molds created by falling debris. In case you haven't figured it out yet, and I think everybody has seen these objects, but I'm talking about the natural casts which were created by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, which took out the city of Pompeii and Herculaneum. You know, when they first started to dig this up in the early 17th century, the only thing they had no interest in the past. The only reason they wanted to dig up that city was for all the gold and goodies that they could give to the King of France as tribute. But it was later on, say 130 years after the first excavation of Pompeii, that this Italian archaeologist got the bright idea, all of these natural casts, why don't we fill them in with the plaster of Paris? And then he pulls the surrounding debris away, and we've got like the famous dog that you've seen, and there's people either embracing one another as they perish or, you know, trying to run. You've seen these all, but yeah. What is Johns doing, according to Steinberg, other than creating the way that our cities, in particular New York, would look to us if it were wiped out in an instant and there was nothing left but plaster casts, the remains of our civilization? The way we would look if we were dug up by people 1,000 years later. What would remain of us? This. And to picture New York as if it was Pompeii, I think is not just fascinating, but it's incredibly timely when Steinberg is doing this in 1962, because I said at the beginning of my lecture, it's the height of the Cold War. Americans are walking around on a daily basis haunted by the idea that they could be wiped out in a flash. And what would be left? Nothing but the meaningless debris of their lives. So this is an ingenious interpretation of work which Johns brings into the world for the first time and for which he offers no explanation whatsoever. And yet after years of mulling it over and losing sleep at night, and then finally seeing, well, wait a minute, through this exchange of points of orientation, we've been given a world which is flattened of all meaning, and yet at the same time becomes all the more meaningful once we learn to see the new view of ourselves that it provides us when properly received by a brilliant critic. Now, is this actually what Johns really meant? We don't know, but this is precisely the role of criticism in the 20th century. It is to complete the creation of the work of art by finding the way to receive it into the body of works we now know to be valuable. Quote a famous poem written by the American poet Wallace Stevens. It's called Postcard from the Volcano. Well, gee, I wonder what volcano that would be. Mount Vesuvius. He's talking about walking around Mount Vesuvius, combing over the wreckage, looking at the dead man's bones, and saying, you know, one day children are going to be looking at us and wondering what type of lives we lived. And the famous line, children picking up our bones will never know that these were once as swift as foxes on the hill. But the important line that he states is that what they say about us will become a part of what we are. And this is exactly what Steinberg is doing with Johns. What statement he makes about the art becomes a part of what the art is. This is an ongoing process, and we're all involved with it, even if only in the form of hating modern art. The very act of hating modern art is only going to make more people determined to produce even crazier art. Crazier in the sense that it deprives you of just one more thing that you thought you loved. So this is Steinberg's interpretation of Johns. I think it's brilliant, and I think it's incredibly honest of him to not admit simply that he was at a loss, but show you the process whereby he works his way toward appreciation and receptiveness to this new piece.